So yesterday we laid out the limited options in Syria, from a full-scale ground invasion to establishing a no-fly zone. Our next guest says there is no future for that country with President Assad still in power. So how does the U.S. make that happen? Joining us from Capitol Hill, Deputy Republican Whip, Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. Thanks very much for being our guest.
You bet.
I say this I just honestly want to know what your gut is on the president's potential to have a well-thought-out policy on Syria, given that he has limited credibility on some of the things he said about the former president and other people, even Susan Rice recently. It's, I mean it in all honesty, like, where do we move forward here? How do we have hope that there could be something put forward on this crisis that is credible?
Well, look, I saw the president's press conference yesterday, and I was actually very impressed by it. I saw a man that, really said, look, I thought a week ago differently of Assad than I do today. I saw the images of young children dying, and he basically said, I bear responsibility now in terms of the buck stops with me from here forward. So, there's not a lot of great options in Syria, and I think every day that goes by, those options become less. But at least in the very short term, we have never held as a frankly world, not much less just a country, that chemical weapons have no place on the battlefield since World War I, with the exception of this conflict. So I think it's important that we do punishing strikes against the regime and basically say, look, the cost of using chemical weapons, the cost of suffocating children to death with a WMD is going to exceed any benefit you get.
Michael Duffy, what are the possibilities and what are the dangers, given what we know about Trump's discipline issues?
It's probably inevitable, Mika, that the president will launch some kind of military strike, probably with cruise missiles, in the next 7 to 10 days. He's almost duty bound to do that. That has been a kind of standard reply for this kind of action.
I think he once said we don't fight enough wars or something like that.
Right, but I wanted to ask the congressman, beyond that, what other steps would you recommend that, as you said, make it clear that this is unacceptable? It sounds like you're expecting a second wave. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess the bare minimum is a first wave to make it clear that, the bare minimum we could do is say don't use chemical weapons. There is no place for that in the new world. But on the second, if I kind of had my druthers and I could make the decision here, our allies in the Middle East have been very clear that they are interested in doing the work on the ground, but we have to accept that there can be no Assad in Syria. Keep in mind, Assad is creating this brutal environment that I think is maturing the ground and making it easier for ISIS to recruit. If you're a 10-year-old kid, your dad was killed by somebody, and you see ISIS as the only kind of opponent to Bashar al-Assad, who brutalized your family, and you don't have an education, you don't have opportunity, you're going to be recruited. So I would like to see long-term humanitarian safe zones, a no-fly zone enforced by the United States and its allies, and then ultimately there will need to be a ground force, but it does not need to be American troops, because I think the Middle East partners, and they've said it, are willing to do it.
Elise.
Congressman Elise Jordan here. You're recommending some options that are pretty robust use of military force. Do you think that this is something that President Trump can do unilaterally, or and what kind of alliance should he seek out? How should he go about doing it? But also, should there be congressional approval of this military action that you're recommending?
So I really put a lot of foreign policy power in the executive branch, which I think is constitutional. I think he, and I think President Obama in 2013 could have as well, I think he can make this decision without coming to Congress. We have the power to declare war. He has the power for initial strikes like that as commander-in-chief. I think he can put a coalition together, something the United States can uniquely do. But let me say this too. I think we can come to a negotiated solution in Syria, but Assad has to know that the alternative to him stepping away from power and maybe finding sanctuary somewhere like Russia, because they seem to love him, the alternative is he may die. And you do that by inflicting strikes against the regime, having a stick behind the carrot, and the carrot is saying, okay, now we can pursue a diplomatic solution, but in lieu of that, we're going to continue to strike the regime.
Congressman, can I just quickly follow up? You mentioned Russia. How do you propose deconflicting with Russian forces that are on the ground? Because this could very quickly pull us into war with Russia. The kind of strikes that you're recommending where, you know, we could kill Russian soldiers and end up in war ourselves?
Well, if the Russians, so what I'm kind of advocating in the early stages is destroying airfields, so a de facto no-fly zone, taking down missile defense, and ultimately hitting command and control nodes within Damascus, effectively decapitating Assad from his fielded forces so he can't communicate with them and everything else. If there are Russians in those areas, frankly, that is on them. I think what's amazing to me is since the Russians have come into Syria, which they never should have, we have kind of used this idea that the Russians are around as a reason for inaction. I say we collectively, I've heard it out here. Look, the Russians made a decision to back a guy that just used chemical weapons.
Right.
If I was the Russians, I would probably get the hell out of there right now because you now have the ire of the world coming down on you, and it might be the right thing for you to do to leave.
But Congressman, let's be honest, Rodrigo, we're not the Russians, as you know, and throughout his campaign, President Trump had been saying, why not let Russia do the work for us? Why not let Russia handle Syria? So Russia, in some way, shape, or form, is going to have to be involved in whatever the president decides to do regarding Syria. So how do you think he goes about that? Do you think he picks up the phone and calls Vladimir Putin? What do they negotiate? And what does Vladimir Putin have to gain out of it?
I think the calculus changed 3 days ago, and I saw that again. And you know, and I've been critical of the president, obviously, but I've looked at his press conference and I saw in him somebody that literally said, I mean, to say I thought differently of Assad a week ago than I do today is admitting that something very bad happened. Now, if there can be a line open to the Russian ambassador to say, look, we're going to do something, you might want to make sure your people aren't around, and you might want to get out of Syria because you're enabling a guy that basically choked children to death with gas. That's fine. There may be other areas of the world we can work with the Russians, you know, whether it's in China or whatever else. But what we can't do is allow them to take Europe, and we can't give them a role in the Middle East because they back people that use chemical weapons.
Yeah.
And it's something that we haven't seen since World War I, and we cannot begin to get numb to this as a Western society, or God forbid what the future looks like.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, thank you very much.
Anytime.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.